Hey everyone, welcome to this week's reading of Shard of the Sun, picking up with chapter 19, so we will just jump into it. This place is cursed, Ged said again. The old soldier lifted his hand and traced a symbol in the air to ward off evil spirits. The others looked around balefully, and Broderick got the feeling that they didn't want to be there any more than he did. I think we should travel further into the tree line, Broderick said, pointing. The entire forest can't be dead. All but Mark shook their heads in disagreement. Mark led his horse over to one of the blackened trees and tied the reins to one of the few branches that seemed sturdy. Then he turned and addressed them. "Let's move it," he ordered. Grabbing his arming sword from the saddle, he strapped the sheath around his waist. With a nod to Broderick, he walked forth into the woods. Broderick admired the man's courage. He looked to the other soldiers, smiled, and then followed after Mark. After a few minutes, he could hear the others following. The sound of snapping twigs and crunching leaves echoed loudly in the silence. They traveled for the better part of an hour before they stopped to rest. The air was foul and made breathing difficult. Roderick perused the map again, wishing there was some way to know if they were headed in the right direction. Sweat dripped down his face. His eyes and throat burned like fire. He noticed Mark was kneeling down, examining something in the dirt. Roderick walked over and waited for him to speak. The soldier ran his hand through his sweat-soaked hair and stood up. "This used to be a path," he said. "It forks and runs two different directions. The map doesn't show this path." Roderick studied the ground as well. "What should we do?" he asked. Mark shrugged, the clink of his chainmail seeming extremely loud. "Should we split up?" Roderick asked. He scratched his chin and stared into the dead trees, uncertain. "Seems the best course to me," Mark answered, "though I don't think they will agree." He nodded toward the other soldiers. "It can't be helped," Broderick said absently. He could hear a humming sound in his ears. It was faint, but unmistakable. "Joel, Calla, and Ewan, you three will take the path that leads left. Ged, you will accompany me and Broderick to the right. Assuming the paths don't reconnect an hour in, we shall circle back and meet here to determine what to do. Otherwise, we'll see each other on the other path." There was a moment of silence as they all stared at each other. Then, without any words, they grouped together and set out on the different paths. "Do you hear anything?" Broderick asked, looking around at the dead trees. The humming was constant, repeating the same pattern over and over. "Hear what?" Ged grunted. Mark shook his head. "That's odd," thought Broderick. They continued following the trail. It was covered with dead leaves and almost obscured entirely by the elements. Every so often, Mark would push the compost aside with his boot to ensure they were still traveling on it. Broderick found it hard to think clearly with the continuous noise in his ears. He furiously rubbed the skin around his ear with his finger, thinking that perhaps it wasn't a real sound. But it continued. And as they walked deeper into the woods, the sound got louder. It was progressive, steadily growing in volume, until it was as though someone was talking at a normal pitch directly into his ear. It became less of a general hum, and more like words. They were not words he had ever heard before. They were foreign, and evoked pictures in his mind. Images of tall, strong, beautiful trees with vibrant colors invaded his psyche. Healthy animals leaping through shrubbery assaulted him. Nourishing soil fed the foliage. And there was something else, blurred images of forms walking in the background of the images. Roger couldn't make out what or who they were. There was a deep sadness attached to the images. He felt as if he had known these things and now they were gone, lost forever in the past. His eyes watered with the emotional churnings. And then, suddenly, the images and the humming stopped. Broderick froze mid-step. He was so surprised. Mark and Ged looked at him quizzically. Broderick shook his head as if waking from a dream and continued on. The ground rose before them, a small hill that they easily topped. And then they froze. There, at the bottom of the hill and reaching as far as they could see, was life. Massive trees towered overhead. Their trunks were so wide, Broderick doubted 20 men could connect arms around them. The leaves glittered in the light, bright emeralds alight with fire inside them. They could hear the sounds of animals, and the wind gently rocked the branches of the trees. This is a forest as it should be. They descended the hill slowly, gazing up at the trees in awe. Broderick couldn't believe how big they were. They were much larger than the ones he normally cut down for lumber, and the leaves didn't seem normal to him. As they reached the bottom of the hill, one of the leaves fell off a branch and slowly swirled down to the ground. Broderick knelt and picked it up, marveling at its beauty. And he was right. They weren't normal. It was as light as a normal leaf, but it was hard as a rock. It was a rock. Broderick held it up for Mark to see. "It's an emerald!" he exclaimed. Mark took it and investigated the claim himself. His eyes widened in disbelief. "How?" Broderick was just as speechless, and could only shake his head and answer. "That one leaf could fetch a price," Ged hinted. "Makes you wonder what else is in there." They exchanged looks. "Do we dare?" Mark asked. Broderick rose back to his feet. "We haven't come this far for nothing. If you don't want to follow, you don't have to. There's a problem. Joel and the others will suspect ill if we don't return." Just as Mark finished the sentence, they heard someone approaching. Joel staggered onto the path from the side of the living forest and dropped to the ground. Mark rushed over to the young soldier. "He's alive. I don't see any wounds," he added, after turning Joel onto his back. Joel sat up, gasping. "They were captured!" he shouted over and over. Broderick watched in fear as Mark tried to calm him. "Who was captured?" he asked. "The brothers." "Who took them?" Mark demanded. "I don't know. I couldn't see them. They were too fast." "Too fast," he mumbled. Mark looked at Broderick. "We must find them. I don't know what you have come here for, nor do I care, but I will not leave my men behind." "I would never ask you to," Broderick replied. "Let's go and find them." Ged helped Joe to his feet. Drawing his sword, Mark took the lead, followed by Broderick, Joel, and then Ged. They walked cautiously, unsure of who they might be dealing with. Less than 100 paces into the woods, Mark paused, motioning them to be still. Broderick listened intently, but he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Then Mark looked up into the trees. Broderick followed suit, and was stunned to see forms moving around the branches. He almost couldn't see them, for their cloaks made them blend into their surroundings quite deceptively. But they were there, and they were armed. Several of them held bows up, arrows nocked and ready to fire. One of them, Broderick assumed the leader, stepped out from the others. "Turn and go back where you came from." The voice was obviously male, but it sounded like music to Broderick. "I am looking for my men," Mark returned. "Have you seen them?" The figure tilted his head, and Broderick thought he saw a glimpse of long hair hidden beneath the figure's hood. "They are with you?" he asked. "They are." "Then you are all trespassers and must pay the price." "Cut them down," he ordered. The others lifted their bows and drew their strings back. "I seek the Kashaf," Broderick shouted. That caused the figures to hesitate. "The Kashaf? How do you know of the Kashaf?" The leader dropped nimbly to the ground from the tree, easily landing on his feet. He kept his distance and reiterated his question. Broderick eased the troubled look on Mark's face by patting him on the shoulder. "I was told to seek out the Kashaf in the Travailing Woods," he said, "and so I am here. These men are my guards. This is the Travailing Woods, is it not?" The leader bowed low. "This is indeed. We will allow you to enter our domain, but we cannot allow these armed men to enter of their own accord. Then they shall wait for my return outside of the woods." The figure shook his head and raised his hand, palm outward, and said, "Yeshin." Broderick turned to see Mark, Ged, and Joel's bodies slumped to the ground. At first, he thought they were dead, but then he saw they were breathing. "What did you do to them?" he demanded angrily. A gust of wind swept through the branches suddenly, blowing the figure's hood back. Broderick's anger dissipated as quickly as it flared. Pale skin, long hair, and pointed ears greeted him. He was gazing at a thing of legend, a creature only heard of in ancient tales. He was staring at an elf. All right, that's it for chapter 19. We'll be back next Friday with chapter 20. Again, hope you guys are enjoying the story. I know I'm not a pro narrator, but it is fun doing these readings, so hopefully you guys are enjoying hearing the author read the story. It's not as good, I'm sure, but it's fun. Thank you guys for listening, and see you next week.